Buongiorno Mondo, and welcome back to 15 with Balsa, the podcast. I am delighted to be chatting today with art historian and architectural historian Alexandria Brown-Hejazi, who is Allie to me. And I thought it would be interesting to get her take on what it's like to be a young scholar living in Italy. She was formed as an academic in the U.S. We met thanks to Stanford. And now she's decided to stay on. So after winning a prestigious 2-year fellowship that she'll talk to us about, at least for the time being, she thinks that Florence is the place that she wants to be and where she also wants to raise her young son. So Allie, why don't we just get right into it? And let's talk about how you got here. Let's talk about your path to Italy so far.
Okay, so this is our 3rd year here in Florence. I started a fellowship, as you said, at the Kunsthistorische Institute, which is a German art history institute. It's one of the oldest ones in Europe. And it was 2020. It was right in the thick of COVID.
Yeah.
I had a baby named Giorgio. And I'm not Italian, my husband's not Italian, and yet we have this son with an Italian name, okay? And this is because I was doing my PhD at Stanford. It was my 6th year. So in America, PhDs take forever.
Exactly.
And we had gotten a Fulbright to go to Rome. And my very ambitious plan was to go alone with a 3-month-old baby to Rome. And, everything was going to be fine. And then March comes around, COVID happens, and the Fulbright is canceled. So now I'm in California. I have a 3-month-old baby with an Italian name and no plans to go to Italy. And fast forward, maybe 6 months or almost a year later, and I applied for a fellowship in Florence, and I got it. So luckily, my son has an Italian name, and now he speaks fluent Italian. We're here. The fellowship's over. Finished the PhD in the summer. That very casual statement, a lot went into finishing that, which we can talk about later.
Yeah.
But yeah, just really felt like I came alive here. Life felt simultaneously easier and harder at the same time.
Okay.
But underneath all of that, more inspiring and enlivening, and it's something that I just couldn't leave. And so this is the journey of how I found a way to stay.
Yeah. And that's something, I met you sort of a little into your journey. So it wasn't the very beginning, but you were sort of just starting to settle in when you and I met. And I remember when we started to speak more and got a little closer, you confided in me that those early days were really, really difficult for you. And I can imagine you were here on your own, trying to, push your research forward to finish the PhD. At that point, Georgia was 2?
He wasn't even
not
2.
even 2.
Yeah.
So, which we all know, mothers know, it's not the easiest age. And I know that there were a lot of challenges in those early days because your husband was also still back in California. Do you want to tell me a little bit about, when you think about those days now, what were the most difficult things for you?
Yeah, it gives me a lot of pride to think back then, because I think what was really missing then was community.
Yeah.
Right? So, like you said, when you have a child in daycare, they're sick all the time. And when you're alone, trying to take care of a 2-year-old, almost 2-year-old, that's it.
It becomes your whole existence.
It's your whole existence, and it's hard.
I know.
Let's just say that.
I know.
And so now, almost 3 years later, he's sick. And the people I have showing up for me, including you,
thank you,
other moms, other friends without kids, honorary aunties.
That's right.
So I think 3 years down the road, the biggest change has been building a community. Yeah. And the lack of that upon arrival was really hard.
Yeah, and it was something you and I talked about when we did, then become closer and talking, and I told you sort of repeatedly how important it is and how I had this very good fortune to find in Jada's, with her classmates, all these incredibly supportive parents, because when you're doing it on your own and you're far from home, it's like, it's a lot.
It's a lot.
And it's too much sometimes, especially, when they're sick or when you find those even just little things that sort of then take up your day, whether they be bureaucratic, you have to go take care of your immigration stuff at the Questura. I know you had to do that quite a bit, or, consulting with attorneys or whatever. And so it just becomes this big thing, but you're in Florence.
Right, you're in Florence.
So let's talk a little more about how you found community, building community, because I think a lot of people that I talk to do speak of that. So how did you manage in so little time to find such a great community of people?
Yeah, I mean, it took a lot of work, a lot of effort and time. But even before the community part, like just being in Florence and being in Italy, there were some things that actually felt easier.
Like what?
Which sounds crazy because
you're like, tell me.
Okay, so for instance, in California, full-time daycare in California is $2,500 a month, okay? I was a PhD student. I can't afford, that's my entire stipend.
Yeah.
I come to Florence, and the KHI, the Art History Institute with that fancy German name, is on a street that's right across from a daycare. And so the daycare, it was private, but it was still affordable. It was like 400 euros a month.
That's amazing.
It's good. And if the public ones are free. And so we lived right around the corner, right? So literally a 5-minute walk.
Okay.
So we would walk from our apartment. I would drop him off at daycare. I didn't have to drive. I didn't need a car. And I would be working right across the street. And so here I am alone, but I have affordable childcare. I work right across the street. If anything happens,
you're
I'm
right there.
And so I think that's one of the more positive things about Italy and Florence is the small scale of the city, the more affordable nature of raising kids here compared to California, right?
Where it's a whole, I've talked about it on other podcasts, but it's important to underscore that yes, the salaries are really much lower here. And so that's why, in an American's eyes, I was recently talking to somebody who visited and was saying, everything is so inexpensive compared to.
Right. It's important to put into perspective.
Yes,
absolutely.
But the average salary here is like €1,300 a month.
Yeah.
And so, a two-income family with a kid, without grandparents. I mean, we could talk about this for a long time, but those of us who don't have that kind of support network have to rely on daycare, public or private. And the first years of Jada's life, I had to put her in private daycare because we couldn't get into public.
Yeah, we couldn't either.
Right. And then I had to get a full-time nanny. And so that's it. Yeah. Oh, yeah. My salary.
I need that. That's the next on the list.
My salary was that's it. It went straight to nido, straight to the nanny. And then finally when she got into, asilo, public nursery school or preschool, but I still had to have the nanny.
Yeah.
And so, but still, yes, the costs are lower, but comparatively.
So that part felt like a weight off of the shoulders.
No traffic.
Like
we just had to deal with. Right.
We come out the apartment and George was like, Duomo.
Exactly.
So
and you grab a coffee and you see people and it feels very much like and also the neighborhood that you live in, which is one that I lived in for years, is I think still, while it can be touristy, it's still a very authentic neighborhood.
Right.
It's Santa Ambrogio. You just need to kind of turn a different way and you won't see any tourists.
Exactly.
I want to talk a little more about your research because at the time your work, what you're working on now, but I think about how hard it must have been for you in those early days. And I remember when you were telling me, I really felt for you. And I think I also took you under my wing because I remembered how hard it was being a mom and also trying to reconcile a very time-consuming job, and also everything else that I was doing on a daily basis. So I want to talk about your work because you did finish the PhD, and I'm so proud of you.
Yay,
and you also just
8 years.
Yay! So what? And you also completed the Florence Marathon the other day. I think we should say a shout out also to Ali for completing the Florence Marathon. But I want to hear more about your PhD. I want to hear more about the work you're doing. And I know you're teaching now at University of Georgia, which has a program in Cortona, which is super interesting. For those who don't know, most people do know, Cortona is a pretty remote hill town, which is off everybody's radar until Frances Mays wrote a very famous book called Under the Tuscan Sun, which then became a movie and now is almost like a mantra. So I want to know about your research, and I want to know about teaching University of Georgia undergraduates in that reality, which I find very interesting because it's very intimate. It's sort of off the beaten path. It's the antithesis of teaching in a city like Florence. So
Okay.
So go.
Okay, go. Okay. Okay, so research and work and kind of art historical interests. My PhD was focusing on exchange between Italy and Iran in the 1600s.
Very interesting.
Right? Everyone's like, what? I didn't even know that, what was going on in Iran in the 1600s. It's just not typically taught. At least when I was doing art history, in 2005, the focus was always on the Western world, on Europe, on the influence of ancient Greece, on Italy. And I took this class with Paula Finlan at Stanford, and it was called Coffee, Sugar, and Chocolate. And it was all about the movement of commodities throughout the world during the Renaissance, so during the 1400s and the 1500s. And what was so interesting to me was that all of these things that we love still today, they all came from the East. And it was so fascinating because those cultures weren't taught. What was going on in India, what was going on in Saudi Arabia, what was going on in China at that time. And so I started looking more into what was going on in Iran because I have Persian heritage, and I found out that quite a lot was going on. And in fact, this was the birth of diplomacy between the Islamic world and Renaissance Italy. And it just became so fascinating, the meeting of these two different cultures. And how they kind of communicated through art. So I think like art as a communal language between people that quite literally couldn't speak, couldn't do what we're doing. Right. And so that was the kind of focus of the dissertation, and it's something I'm still really interested in, is highlighting kind of diversity in Renaissance art and highlighting communication between different cultures, foreign exchange, also interreligious dialogue between Islam and Christianity.
Wonderful.
And there were some interesting discoveries along the way, like these wives.
Tell me something, because I think it is a subject that is really emerging now. Thank goodness that people are paying attention to those paths, and those unwritten and unspoken about things that were going on, which is obvious. If you just think about Venice and how far the Serenissimo's reach was, right? It's obvious. That's all they were doing, right? They were trading. They were between the East and the West. So why are we so surprised? It's just that nobody talked about it before, right? So tell me one of the stories. What's the story of the wives that you discovered?
So basically, to go from Iran to Italy in 1601 would have taken like almost 3 or 4 years. So the route that you would have had to take was a long route. And it wasn't just like one ambassador traveling along on his own, right? There's no jets. There was they're literally like walking, building boats, trekking on camels and horses. And they would come with a whole group of people. And Persian ambassadors sometimes took their wives. And there was one wife in particular. She was Circassian in origin, so near, modern-day Jordan. And she went back and forth between Iran and Italy at least 8 different times. And so she was one of the most well-traveled women of the day. And yet, because she was a woman, because she was a woman, she was quite literally not included in the archival trail. She wasn't included in the historical accounts of these adventures. And so when I was in Rome in the archives, I found her will because, So after her husband died in Iran, she was persecuted for converting from Islam to Christianity, and she ended up finding religious asylum in Rome. So she lived the last 40 years of her life in Rome, in Trastevere, in the mid-1600s.
Fascinating.
And she died there. So when she died, you make your will. And so I was holding this document written in her own words of all the different things she owned.
Chills.
And all the networks of female, her female friendships,
what
her community.
What we're doing now.
She built her community. And it was just so cool to see, okay, I'm leaving this work of art to, this friend and this.
How beautiful.
Yeah.
What was her name?
Well, her birth name was Samfluf. She was an Amazon woman.
Okay.
But when she converted to Christianity, she became Teresa.
Okay.
Because she was from the Carmelite order, so Saint
Okay,
Teresa.
Saint
so
Teresa,
a powerful female saint, right?
Oh.
And so it's just it was so empowering to learn about this 17th century woman that was traveling on her own, also had a kid. You know, it was weird. I was like inspired by this woman.
You should write a book about her.
I want to.
You should.
Yeah.
Write her story. Also because I think it would be a good movie. Or
Yeah.
even a series. I always tell my guys, with another guest of mine who's a director, I was like, wait, we need to start collaborating on some scripts. But seriously, her story, see?
Her story.
These forgotten people.
Right.
You have a chance to give her a voice, and she left a will. I mean, that's wonderful. It's a great point of departure. And the whole idea of the female friendship networks.
Exactly. And you know what's interesting? Giving her a voice kind of gives me a voice.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things when I started working with study abroad students in Florence, when I would point out, you know, this is a representation of, you know, someone that was Islamic, or this is a representation, students that were, you know, from different backgrounds, they were interested, they felt inspired.
Because they felt more visible.
Exactly.
They felt seen.
Right.
And, you know, so many people, including us women, have just been excluded from the narrative,
right,
let alone a whole diversified population. And now people are looking at paintings finally with a different lens and saying, wait, hold on. So why are these people here?
Right.
Let's look at those, what you did, right? Let's look at those connections. Let's look at those networks. Let's look at the trade routes. Let's look at what kind of, you know, contamination, cultural contamination, if you will. It's everywhere.
Right.
And yet so few people spoke of it. Let's say it wasn't part of the traditional canon, you know, the art historical canon.
It's changing.
Thank God.
Right. And that's what I want to be a part of.
Yay.
Right? Like giving voice to people that didn't have a voice, and hoping that allows students, whether they go into art history or not, like most of them don't.
That doesn't matter. Most don't.
It doesn't matter, but it's a way for them to feel empowered. When you're 18 to 22, it's a very delicate time, you know, especially when you're studying abroad, and to be able to help them find their voice, help them discover who they're becoming. That's what I want to do. Yeah. Right. That's what I want to do at Georgia.
Exactly.
The University
so tell
of Georgia.
me more. Tell me more about that. Tell me more about like also a place like Cortona, which has been so. It's so sad to me because I love Cortona. I think it's one of the most lovely, charming Tuscan hill towns.
Yeah.
And I never go.
Yeah.
And I don't go because I'm afraid that I'm gonna run into all these like under the Tuscan sun groupies. I don't know. Maybe
you might. Yeah.
I might.
Yeah.
Okay. See, so I thought that might happen anyway. But I think it's. I've always thought that it was a great choice for a program because of the intimacy and because it's so small and because it's so beautiful.
It's stunning.
It's stunning. So tell me a little bit more about that experience of teaching University of Georgia students and the kind of things you're doing there. Sometimes I see you're doing really interesting things.
Yeah.
It seems very hands-on. It seems very interactive. So tell me a little bit about your teaching right now.
Yeah. So exactly. It's at the top of a hill town. So you take the train to Cambuchia, and then you're not done. You have to take a bus, and it literally winds you up the hill, and you arrive at the top of the hill. And you look down, and you literally see the lake where Attila the Hun, you know, had his victory. Like it's a historic, ancient Etruscan hilltop town, and you feel it. You feel the air of the Etruscans there. So there's just a different air. Yeah, quite literally. The program is really interesting because it was born from the art department.
I remember that. Yeah, I know the program.
Yeah, and so I've learned a lot from the students because they're mostly artists.
So they're visual artists for the most part?
They're photographers, painters.
Okay.
And so I think for me that was one of the most rewarding parts of it was learning from them, right? Learning art history from an artist perspective. But then, of course, it's changing now. They have more business classes, psychology classes. And I don't know, I just love learning from you're never not a student. That's always my philosophy.
I agree. 100%.
So always learning from them. But I told them day one, you know, this isn't going to be the art history where you're made to memorize, you know, names and dates, that doesn't matter to me. And I think a
Wow,
lot of them.
that's so antithetical to the kind of art history that I did when I
Me
was in college.
too. Me too.
In the dark, slides,
Yep.
all the tests. I would
Yes.
fall asleep.
Yeah.
I tried every semester.
Exactly.
And then the tests were always, I remember the slides.
Yeah.
And you had to ID
Right.
the artist, the year,
Exactly.
the title.
Yeah.
It was very meticulous.
Yeah. No, I told them day one, that's not
Wow.
this kind of art history that I'm interested in.
Okay.
I want you all to, use this time when you're studying abroad to explore something that you've been thinking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
See if you can somehow relate it to the art we're seeing, these different cities. One of the amazing things about the program is we take trips. And so we're looking at the art literally together in person.
Wonderful.
We go to Rome, we go to Venice, we go to Assisi.
Okay.
And so for me, it's more about communicating the story, right, of these works of art and this architecture and
Nice.
hopefully inspiring something about them.
Yeah.
So I take a lot of time to get to know what they're interested in
Okay.
and trying to relate the art back to them.
Okay, so it becomes, obviously, because this is a generation also where everything is very personal.
Right.
Everything is identity-based.
Right.
And so I think that's actually a great way. A lot of people seem to have difficulties communicating with Generation Z, and I think that this kind of approach is actually the best approach to take.
Yeah.
And on that note, I do want to ask you, you mentioned, yes, it's the University of Georgia program has now expanded, but it began really just as a place for artists. And I remember that for students of art, the visual arts. What value do you see in today's world? Like, why should a young student still, I have always said, I think everyone should take at least one art history class in their life, right?
Yeah.
I think that's sort of the beauty of the U.S. education system. A liberal arts education gives you that possibility, right? But what do you see the value, why should everyone take an art history class, or what do you think a young person today can learn from looking at these works in Italy specifically, or anywhere else? And feel free to use specific examples. But why should a student study art history today? In our world of social media and everything moving so quickly, what can be gained from standing in front of, I don't know, a Piero della Francesca painting? What's there? What lessons are still there for us?
It's such a good question. It makes me think of why I was interested in art and art history from a very, very young age. And I think that it even goes back to my PhD research and the use of art as a means of communication.
Yeah.
And it's a way of expression without words, right?
Right.
And so you can look at something and you feel it.
Yeah.
You don't have to read it. You don't have to read what someone else tells you about it. You literally feel the piece, right? And so, just for instance, in Florence, I love to take my students all around the city, but specifically just looking at the dome, right? And it's this kind of example of how you can achieve something without knowing how you're going to achieve it, right? So I always tell them, let's look at this dome. Let's learn the story of how this dome was built, right? Because for years the cathedral didn't have a dome.
That's right.
Right? And to me that exemplifies this way of thinking that you can embark upon something without having a plan, right? And so Florence knew what she wanted. She wanted a dome that was high as the ones in Constantinople, as wide as the ones in the Pantheon in Rome, but didn't know how to do it until Brunelleschi came along. And so Brunelleschi had, a challenge. And so it's kind of this theory of working backwards, right? And so the way he was able to achieve this masterpiece of engineering.
That nobody understands still to this day.
Well, we do.
You do? Everyone always says it's a mystery.
See, this is what I don't like when people say it's a mystery. Because
we
do know.
Tell us.
Do know. We do know. I hear tour guides saying that all the time, and I'm like, no, but we know. Okay, so let's do it. This is what So, first of all, the most amazing thing about the dome is what we don't see anymore, which is the scaffolding.
Yeah, I know.
This amazing scaffolding, right? Because at the time, wood was very scarce, and so he created this whole system that we don't see. And that, to me, with Florence, we see all these amazing buildings and works of art, but it's the things that we don't see anymore, which is the real meraviglia, right?
Yeah.
And so the scaffolding system that allowed him to take things up and down really quickly with these oxen that were just circling, also like, thank you, animals, for all of your labor,
exactly.
right? These buildings. So as the scaffolding was also this method of laying bricks, which was herringbone fashion, which, by the way, comes from the East, so might have been some influence from ancient Persia, ancient Mesopotamia, that allowed the dome to lock itself in place. And so that's what I tell my students too. Like, you can go forward, vai avanti, and you will sustain yourself, right? You don't need to worry about falling apart, like just like this dome that you're looking at, right? You will lock yourself in place just like the dome. And then, of course, this belt, this wooden belt that, you know, the dome is basically wearing. And it's like this illusion of height, too, because it's two domes. Anyway, so we do know how we did it. And this is the thing. We can teach these students, like, there was this vision. And so I always tell them to look at the dome and think about something that they want to do, but they don't quite know how to do it yet. They don't know what next step to take.
Yeah.
And so
I love that.
Right?
I love that approach. Yeah, because we all are. I think it's important, especially when we're young, but I think you realize this you're very young. I'm a little older, but I think we all are kind of works in progress. And I don't think you knew, for example, when you came here with baby Giorgio, that you would be where you are today. You thought this was just going to be like, yes, a fellowship, 2 years, okay. And I think, when I first came to Italy, I just didn't think that I would be here now. And so
you didn't?
No, I don't think so. No, so you're trying to interview me. You warned me that you were going to try to do this. You can, it's fine. I don't think I did, no. And there have been times I wanted to leave.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that. Let's just talk about that for a second. Even though I would love to talk, I want to go back to aesthetics, and I want to go back to a lot of other stuff. You use the word meraviglia, which I adore. And I think what you really hit on is that with your students, what you're giving them is not only this exposure to Italy's aesthetics and to the great art and to the great architecture, but what you are doing is you're really helping them understand the way the study abroad experience should be transformative for them. And it's not just what they're studying, it's the way they're interacting with what they're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's the thing that really, at least for me personally, I think that's why I stayed. A lot of the reason why I stayed is because of just the beauty and the meraviglia. And then, of course, the warmth, I think, of the people, even in a place like Florence, where, as I've already said, people aren't known for their friendliness, but there is a kind of human interaction that's a little different in the United States. I think we're a little more removed from people. So I wanted to ask you a little more about the decision to stay here, and would you ever go back to the States? I'm just going to hit you with the big question, because you're a scholar, you're a young scholar in the humanities. Some people out there might not know how tenure works in the U.S., things like that, but it's not an easy place to be, academia.
Yeah.
But would you go back? Do you miss those hallowed halls?
I don't know. I think what I've realized about the time in Florence is that I'm done with making long-term plans, because we can plan all we want and you just don't know what life is going to throw at you. You don't know how you're going to change, how a city can change you, right? And I think that's what's also been so invigorating about living here is the people I've met. They're all living life differently. So we call it like checking out of the matrix.
Tell me more about that. So, because I think this is tied to what I'm seeing in Florence. We've talked about this. We've organized networking things around this. There's this energy, young energy and influx coming from all over the world. A lot of interesting people, and you're kind of in that milieu. So tell me a little more about that. I like that. Tell me what's going on.
Yeah. So like when I got the fellowship, it was like, okay, we'll do the fellowship and then we'll go right back to California and we'll be back to programming as scheduled, right? Back to suburban living, yada, yada, yada. Well, no. And I think that, like, again, I became empowered by seeing mostly these amazing women that were just living life differently in a way that I didn't think was even an option. I didn't even know that it was an option. So, for instance, you know, we would talk about community. And so to meet these women and to build this community, I literally met them online, like on Facebook groups, like,
Right.
hey, you know, I'm an academic here, but I want to meet people that aren't academics. Does anyone want to go dancing? And then got added to this group of females that, you know, were in their 30s and 40s and were living in Florence, and started going out with them. And just, it was a whole nother world that opened up, right?
Yeah.
So people from all around the world, from Kenya, from New York, from England, that were in Florence. And some of them were only here for a couple months. Some of them are here more permanently. But they all were just living life unconventionally. And it's until you see someone that's doing something different that you don't, so just like the dome, right? Unless you know that it's an option to do things differently or think bigger than you even imagined, you don't even think about doing it for yourself.
It's so amazing that you said that, because that's exactly what I went through a year ago when I decided to leave, you know, to leave the security, the safety. And I think a lot of it, there are two things I think as you're speaking. One is obvious that the pandemic was a game changer, because that's the way I think that attitude shift comes. That sort of, it's not even an attitude shift. It's like you see other paths, right? Because nothing is really within our control, right? Okay. But looking at the positive side, which I'm starting to see more and more of the pandemic, which is that it was freeing for a lot of us.
Yeah.
And so saying, you know what? I can kind of just go to Florence for a couple of months. I'll see what happens, you know? And if it doesn't work out, I'll go back. But we're so conditioned as Americans.
So conditioned.
It's terrible.
Right.
And, you know, to live that life where, you know, you talked about like scheduling. Can you imagine Georgia now? You'd be between like, I don't know, and he's still a toddler. And you just be like, okay, well, you know, Mandarin lessons and this, and then, you know, and it's all scheduled in the playtime, but the playtime has to have some kind of, you know, educational or something value, because then, you know, it's all that
Planned,
race and
schedule,
everything's planned, and especially children, even still, so much so that, you know, Americans have to talk about non-scheduled playtime and scheduled play. I mean, that doesn't even exist here. That is such a foreign concept. Like, kids are kids. And Italy loves kids, by the way. Just as an FYI, it's a good place to raise kids, because because Italians don't have that many babies. There aren't that many. I mean, things hopefully are getting better there too. But it's a nice place to raise kids, because everybody loves kids here. They love kids. And so it makes your life easier. And it's also a very kid-friendly culture, right?
Very kid-friendly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And everything is kind of made easier.
Exactly, right. So it's not all hard and negative, right? There's a bit of both, like in everything.
Right.
And so will we ever go back to the States? I don't know. Maybe we will.
Maybe I will too. I don't know either. I don't know. For now, I'm thinking, I'm happy I'm here. I mean, I'm feeling the same thing that you talk about, and it's sort of something that we connected around when we first met. And, you know, we've always been about community and you know, meeting really incredible, especially women, but not only, and really kind of raising each other like up, and, you know, holding each other up and helping each other. And I think that's something that really has gotten lost, and that if we don't find again in our society, we're really going to be in a lot of trouble. So, you know, I talk about community all the time. So I'm not going to bore you with community. I want to go back to...
It's important.
It is important. It's fundamental. But I want to go back to one of your projects, which is called Sprezzatura. Sprezzatura by Alexandria. And I want you to talk a little bit more about what that is and how you got inspired for the name, because it's one of my favorite words in Italian.
It's
and I don't know if I've ever told you that.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
No.
So much so that I use it all the time.
Yeah.
But when I saw it, I was like, oh, Allie picked such a good name. So tell me more about Sprezzatura, which is a play on words.
It's a play on words. So it kind of all goes back to when I was trying to figure out how to stay in Florence. And I had this mentor from my graduate experience at Harvard, and she had lived in Florence in, I think, the 60s or the 70s for many years, and she was responsible for building up a lot of the study abroad programs. Her name's Christine Smith. She's iconic.
Okay.
And she still teaches at Harvard. And so I wrote to her and I was like, Christine, something's happened. I've fallen in love with Florence. I never want to leave. And so she wrote me back an email. She said, here's what you should do. Write to every single study abroad program in Florence, in Rome, in the larger Tuscany area, introducing yourself, proposing a course that they don't already have. Next, you need to contact Elaine, who was also her former student at Syracuse, and you need to introduce yourself and go meet her. And so she just laid out this roadmap, right? She didn't say, like, it's impossible. She gave me, like, steps to take. And so I did it. I wrote to, I think, 150 different schools and introduced myself. I got 3 responses.
Yay!
Yeah.
That's great, though.
Right?
I mean,
Yeah.
but you have an amazing
But that's
CV.
the thing. Like, you just you have to try. If you don't try.
You have to persevere. You have
Right.
to persevere because
Right.
if not, yeah.
Right. And so that's also how I got the Georgia job. If I hadn't have introduced myself, I never would have even known about that opportunity. And I met with Elaine, who has become, someone I admire very, very deeply. Hopefully you'll interview her on the podcast.
I hope soon. She's someone I admire very much as well.
And so she's someone that put the idea into my head that, like, there was an alternative to academia, right? She does amazing tours, excursions, experiences. And she was like, you should try, like, see what you think. And so I enjoyed doing them for the students so much, right? You just see people's eyes light up, right? It's different than teaching in a classroom,
Oh, it's
right?
completely different.
And people that are here on holiday, you can share all this deep knowledge that, I've been studying for 15 years, finally being able to speak to people that aren't in academia, right? And so the people you meet, I'm all about connection.
Yeah.
And so it's connecting with people. And even on the tours, you find out what they're interested in and you kind of tailor it to them. Because I want everyone that I interact with art and architecture to feel inspired or moved. And it's all about finding a little bit about their story.
Yeah.
And so it's just something I'm kind of exploring alongside teaching and seeing, kind of what plays out. And it is the more experimental, not stable route, right?
Yeah.
The more stable route would be pursuing academia in America, which even my face, you
I
can't
saw
see my
your
face, it just
expression
drops.
just dropped. And that's
Yeah.
why I never got the PhD.
Yeah.
The first thing I told you,
Yeah.
Allie, get the PhD.
Yeah,
and then
you
can
did.
do whatever you
Yeah.
want. And I still believe that, but you can also not do that if you don't want to.
Right, yeah.
You know what I'm saying? But get the PhD.
Right.
Because once you have it, it doesn't matter.
Right.
So tell me more about Sprezzatura, the name.
The name. So sprezzatura is a word that was first used by Baldassare Castiglione in the Renaissance, and it was in a book of the courtier. So basically, how to be at a Renaissance court, right? How to make an impression, una bella figura. And basically it meant, it's like Beyonce's I woke up like this phrase. Like, it's about concealing all the hard work, the hours and hours and years of training, and making something look just effortless and graceful.
Grace under pressure.
Right?
Beautiful.
Grace under pressure.
Grace under pressure. And it's effortless. And it's something that Italians have. And it's one of those words. There's that class at Stanford, like German in 10 words or whatever. Those words that are almost untranslatable because they're so linked to the culture.
Yeah.
And I think sprezzatura, actually, now that I think about it, it's what we've been talking about this whole time. And it's that thing that's missing from the way we were raised and conditioned as Americans, especially on like a certain path. But it's something that we've always had. But maybe it took Italy for us to realize that it was there. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because Italians always pull it off. You have no idea how, right?
Right, exactly.
Like, they just won the Davis Cup.
Right.
How?
I don't know what the Davis Cup is.
Oh, sorry,
but-
it's tennis. I'm a tennis.
I'm like,
I
yes,
love that.
the Davis Cup.
Yes, the Davis Cup. Just always be like, this is going to be unedited. All my podcasts are unedited. But Italy just won the Davis Cup. It's a huge deal for tennis. And
Okay.
it's typical Italian, like they were total underdogs. I mean, nobody thought that this could happen, but Italians somehow miraculously like always pull it off, right?
I know.
And that's Sprezzatura, and that's the beauty of being in this country. And I think you really hit the nail on the head, because it's all about that, the surprises.
Exactly.
But being able to handle them gracefully.
Exactly. And so on the tours, that's what I want to unveil with people.
Yeah.
The work, the cross-cultural influences, the collaboration, right? These masterpieces of art, they weren't made by one artist. It's a whole team of artists. It's a whole system. And so uncovering that, but also taking them on a tour that allows them to escape, reality for a bit and be transported to these worlds.
And also going around Florence with you it's
fun.
It's so much fun.
Fun.
I've done one of your Palazzi and Prosecco tours. I've only done one, but I thought the idea was brilliant, and I still think it's a brilliant idea. And I think it is. I'm happy that that your mentor at Harvard, Christine, and that Elaine, who is also a mentor. Sometimes it's just a question of somebody opening your eyes to possibilities.
Exactly.
And it's something that for me is very personal, because I didn't see that as being possible, for example, for me. And then I met you, and I met other people, and I saw something happening. I don't know. You and I have talked about this a lot, but it was almost like I saw such a change happening around me. I saw this movement. I saw this evolution. I saw Florence coming to life in a way that I hadn't seen. And, meeting people like you and other people who are creative, or who are drawn to Florence because of the aesthetics, or because of, the need to raise a child in a place that is, I don't know, relatively worry-free. I mean, that's peace of mind. And I don't think you'll ever, as a mother, I don't think you ever sort of stop worrying.
No, I was just going to say, I'm all constantly worried. I'm worried right now.
I am too. I'm always worried. But when your kid is here, I think, there are realities in Italy that don't exist in the United States. Like, there's very little violence, like extreme gun violence. There are no guns here. It's very hard to get a gun.
Yeah.
And so it's not something you need to worry about.
Right.
And I have an older child, so it's a little different. With a 3-year-old, there are other things you worry about. With a 16-year-old, it's much nicer that she's here than she's in the States. At least that's how I feel right now. But since we're coming to the end of our conversation already, and it's really flown by, I have other questions that I wanted to ask you, or that I'd like to ask you. But most of all, I really want to know if you and I, if I said to you, Allie, I want to go with you today. I want you to take me to a couple of places in Florence that are significant for you. We've already talked about the Duomo. We've already talked about other places. They don't have to necessarily be tied to art history. But if I said to you, Allie, I want you to take me to places that either for you sort of, I don't know, have some kind of personal or professional, let's say, meaning, or places that have become home to you for whatever reason, because this is home for you now, isn't it?
Yeah. I would say probably the Medici tombs, so where all the dead Medici are, and the
It's
Cappella.
one of my favorite places.
Yeah.
I'd actually love to go with you.
We should go.
Let's go.
Yeah.
No, I have to go also because I promised one of my podcast guests was Daphne DeCinto, who's done this amazing documentary, not documentary, excuse me, a short film on the life of Alessandro de' Medici, Il Moro. And so she got his name put on his tomb. It wasn't on his tomb up until like very short time ago. So we need to go together because I want to take a picture of it for her because she hasn't been able to see it yet because she's in the States. Anyway, so you would take me to the Medici tomb. Why?
Yeah, well, it's one of the places that, when I first started doing the tours for Stanford and Florence, which I have to say, that was really a fundamental experience, and that really opened the door for all of this.
The Renaissance walks. That was a great initiative. It wasn't my idea. I wish I could take credit for it. But
Yeah, so
I'm glad that I had the intelligence to email you.
Yeah.
But it wasn't my idea, the Renaissance walks. Yeah.
So that was really like a game changer,
Yeah.
very fundamental part. And that's one of the first places we went with the students. But the Cappella dei Principi, not the Michelangelo tombs, that's beautiful too. Really a game changer in architecture. But
Yeah.
the one with all the different colored marble stones, it is important to me to take students there because it represents kind of the Medici reaching the limits of their ambition, right? So it's kind of like right when the Medici are on the decline, but they still have this kind of grandiose way of
Yeah.
thinking. And so it's still that kind of Brunelleschian age ambition. But all these different stones are coming from all around the world, right? And so when you are in the Michelangelo chapel, it's Carrara marble and Pietra
Right.
Serena, that white and gray. So it's building from what's local. And then you walk and you go to this other chapel a couple hundred years later, and all of a sudden you have stone lapis from Afghanistan, porphyry from Turkey. And so it's a material representation of how Florence has now come into contact with the world.
How beautiful.
And so it's all about, it's also the first introduction of slavery into Florence. So it's an important topic to talk about,
That's
the opening
right.
of Livorno. And so there's a lot of different topics, race, cross-cultural encounters, architectural, heights.
Yeah.
It's a whole
It's
different.
fascinating.
Yeah.
You can in one, and I think there we go back to what you were saying about being able to teach
Yeah.
in these spaces.
Yeah.
And that's something you can't do in the U.S.
No,
And
exactly.
it completely changes the experience
Yeah.
because, these kids can touch with their hands.
Yeah.
And really then things come alive. And
Exactly.
you're telling stories.
Exactly.
And you're making those connections. That's just so exciting. We have to go together. Where else would you want to take me? That's special, a place of your heart,
Well, I mean, also, I just have to do a little plug for Eleanor of Toledo really quick. So, like,
Of
Palazzo
course.
Pitti
Yeah.
is basically like a palace bought by this amazing Medici woman who was a mom of 11 kids. And she was basically running Florence when her husband Casimir wasn't around. And so Palazzo Pitti to me represents this like really savvy real estate purchase by
Oh, yeah.
Eleonora.
Prime.
Right?
Prime. And we did that on the Prosecco
Yes,
Palazzi tours.
yes.
And that was where we upped the ante, right? That was when
That's when we
got
drink
the
the
good stuff.
Franciacorta.
That's
Exactly.
the Franciacorta, because that was the fancy digs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a space of female empowerment for sure. Let's see. I mean, my favorite place in Florence is this tiny astrological dome in Santa Croce, which not a lot of people know
Yeah.
about. It's in the Pazzi Chapel.
Yeah.
And it's just this lapis dome. It's painted in blue, and it has a constellation painted on top of it. And not a lot is known about it, and I like it simply because we don't know that much about it. And it's this kind of space that blurs. Is it the ocean? Is it the sky? What moment in time is this capturing, right? It's on this dome. It's beautiful, and it's just very enigmatic. And since this is a time of, for me, right, a time of experimentation,
Yeah.
a time of mystery, of exploring untrekked paths,
Yeah.
to be in a space that's kind of also unknown, and you don't know what it's quite about, but you know that it's beautiful, and you know
Yeah.
that it's empowering, and you somehow know that it's right.
Yeah.
So for me, that's a special space.
Okay, so this has been a wonderful chat. I had
Thank
no
you.
doubt that it would be, but now I have all these places that you're going to need to take me to.
Anytime.
So you have to stay in Florence just to be my personal,
Anytime.
spiritual and artistic guide. I've so enjoyed this conversation, and I want you to come back, and maybe we were joking in the car ride over that we should do like a carpool karaoke type thing for the podcast,
yes.
but actually maybe we could do a little video one live from one of these spaces
I would love
and
to.
do like a mini,
Yeah. Why not?
not like a lesson, but just do something, like have a conversation in one of these spaces. I think that would be so much fun.
It would be beautiful.
So thank you again. And I'm wishing you so much luck, because I really hope you can, discover more about this space and write more about Teresa and write her story, her book, or, Leonora di Toledo. I mean, she's everyone's idol, but I love how we talked about all these spaces in Florence and how you've woven in these incredible stories and so much knowledge in such a short amount of time. So grazie mille.
Thank you.
E grazie a tutti voi.
Grazie.
E alla prossima volta.